folks, Matthew Weiss here. Welcome to Weiss Advice powered by BeatStars.com. In this tutorial, we are going to be discussing one of the most important and fundamental signal processors in the mixing process, and that is the equalizer. But before we get started, for the duration of this tutorial, I will be using a beat that's provided by Tuna Beats. He can be found at BeatStars.com/TunaBeats. Thank you for letting me use this record. Let's get started. All right, so what is an equalizer? Well, an equalizer is very similar to a level control, except instead of pulling up or down the overall signal, we're just going to pull up or down a portion of the signal. And that signal could be a wide band, such as all of the lows or all of the highs, or it could be a selected band of frequencies, like a small portion revolving around, say, 500 hertz. It allows us to target very certain sections of the sound rather than the sound as a whole. So I'm going to pull up an equalizer here. I have it on my master channel, which means it will be affecting everything. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how we can change the sound real quick. And then I'm going to start breaking down a lot of common equalizers, the controls, and how they function. All right, let's check it out. All right, so some of the common EQs we're going to see are going to be parametric EQs, like the one that I'm playing with, or a fixed EQ, like, for example, the Fruity EQ-UO. This specific model of fixed EQ is oftentimes referred to as a graphic equalizer, and all of the points are fixed. We cannot sweep them or move them around. In a parametric EQ, as you saw, we can sweep them, move them around, change how they look functionally here by making them wider or narrower. We have a lot of control with parametric EQs. With fixed EQs, we don't have as much control. We can simply move any frequency setting up or down, but we cannot move it left or right. We cannot change the width. The only way we could change the width is by adjusting neighboring bands. So you might be thinking at this point, what is the point of using a fixed EQ over using a parametric EQ? And the reason being is that extra care is put into how a fixed EQ functions at those specific points. And so while parametric EQs are definitely better in terms of utility and use, they are not necessarily always as good in terms of sound. Now, in the particular case of Fruity Loops, I happen to be a big fan of the parametric EQ too. I think this is one of the best stock EQs out of any DAW, meaning digital audio workstation, whether that be Pro Tools, Studio One, Logic. They all have good stock EQs in them, but I think that Fruity Loops has one of the best. So we're going to be focusing mainly on the parametric EQ for this lesson. I'm going to begin by going over the different types of filters we're commonly going to be using in our mixing. The first one I'd like to discuss is the pass filter. This is the most rudimentary filter style, and it is simply a filter that rejects a certain band of frequency while allowing another band of frequencies to pass. So I'm going to start by clicking over here and going to Type, and here we get a lot of options. I'm going to start with a high pass filter. Now, this graphic really accurately displays what's going to be happening. Everything underneath this curve and above is going to be what passes. These are the high frequencies above our corner frequency. The higher I move the corner frequency, the higher the pass band gets, and the more sound gets rejected. Let's hear what that sounds like. Similarly, on the other end, we have what's called a low-pass filter. And this is going to do the same thing, except instead of passing the high frequencies, it's going to eliminate high frequencies while passing the low frequencies, which is why it's called a low pass. These are very, very useful when we want to eliminate sounds that are unnecessary within a sound itself. For example, if we have a lot of bass tone or hum that got recorded into our hi-hat, or there's a lot of excess body in our hi-hat, we may want to use a high-pass filter to get rid of that because it's not really going to be necessary to the sound. Similarly, if we have a lot of high-end in our bass, we might not necessarily want all that high-end because it could interfere with some of the other elements that are living up there, like a snare, a hi-hat, or the kick of a click drum. Now, if we put these two together, we get what's called a band pass. And here we can see that as we move it along, we are eliminating both low and high frequencies, and we are only allowing the pass of the band that we are centered on. In general, we're not going to be using bandpass filters too often in our mixing. They're most useful for special effects. The next type of common filter we're going to be looking at is going to be the shelf filter. This is very similar to the pass filter, except not only can we eliminate frequencies that are above or below our cutoff, but we can also add frequencies above or below our cutoff. In addition to this, we also have finer control over what degree we want to do our attenuation or our boosting. So let me demonstrate. I'm going to switch my filter here to type, and I'm going to go to high shelf. And over here, I'm going to go over to type, and I'm going to go over to low shelf. So as you can hear, as I start adjusting the corner frequencies, I can target where our shelf begins, and by turning up or down the level, I can determine how much of the EQ I actually want. The last type of filter I want to show you, and probably the most common one that we'll be using, arguably, is going to be the peak filter, or sometimes called a bell filter, and it's because it looks exactly like a bell. What this allows us to do is pull up a band of frequencies around our corner frequency, both above and below, and we can either boost or cut. These are extremely useful filters because we can target very specific frequency areas if there's something that we don't like or something that we want to make a little bit more apparent. Now we're going to take a look at some of the most important controls that we use when we are setting our equalizer. And the first is going to be an obvious one, and that is just simply the level. The level is going to be the degree of boost or cut that we apply to a signal, and it's measured in decibels. Pretty straightforward. I don't think much explanation is needed there. The second most important control is going to be our corner frequency, and this is where along the frequency spectrum we are going to be targeting in order to set our EQ. We can do this either in the low end, the low mids, the upper mids, or the high end. And lastly, the most important control in terms of getting the exact quality of our EQ that we want is going to be the bandwidth control, or sometimes called the Q control. And I said quality for a very specific reason. The reason it's called a Q control is because it is sometimes called a quality control, and that's not to refer to the overall quality of it in terms of fidelity, but the characteristic of it in terms of bandwidth. So in other words, that's a very long way of saying it's a width control. Now, the width control is going to do things a little differently on each type of filter. Let's start with the peak filter. This one's pretty easy. If I make my boost, and then I start adjusting the bandwidth, I can either make it a very narrow band of frequencies. This will sound like a very specific resonance. Or I can make my shape very, very wide, and this is going to contain a whole lot of the signal. When we're using peak EQs or bell EQs, we like to use a very, very tiny Q or a narrower Q when we are targeting very, very specific sounds. The narrowest being an annoying resonance that might have somehow gotten into, say, a vocal recording, or perhaps just something that has an annoying resonance to begin with and we want to get rid of it. We're going to use a slightly wider Q if we're simply trying to get a quality away from something or bring a subtle quality out of something, but we're looking at something very specific here. We're going to use broader EQs when we're trying to adjust the overall tone of something. For example, we may want something to just be generally brighter or generally more present, or we might want something to be generally a little bit less harsh. So we use a broader band here, which is going to sound a little bit more natural because it's pulling into the dip a little bit more gradually. Now, if we look at a high shelf or a low shelf, when we start adjusting the Q, we get something very interesting. The band itself becomes gradual or steep. And this can create some unique effects. A very gradual EQ, again, is going to sound a little bit more natural. So when we want to do something like subtly lift the treble of a record, that's going to sound a little bit more transparent and natural than if we do it using a very narrow Q. You can hear that the assertion of the hi-hat is a lot more present when I use the narrower Q, whereas when I use the gradualer Q, it just makes the entire record feel like it's leaning into the treble a little more. But I think the most interesting place where the bandwidth control or Q control comes into play is going to be on our pass filters. So here is a typical setup for a pass filter. Watch what happens when I start adjusting the Q. When I adjust the Q to be more steep or narrow, I get what's called a resonant high-pass filter, and what that does is it eliminates frequencies below the corner, but it actually boosts frequencies at the corner and above it, just like this little hill here. When I start moving to a wider bandwidth, the curve becomes a lot more gradual, and it starts pulling down frequencies that are actually above the corner frequency. Again, this can be used to create a more transparent or less transparent result. The last control I want to discuss is one that we're not going to need too often, but some EQs do offer this option when we're creating our settings, and that is going to be the order. The order functions similarly to the width, except for instead of defining the overall width of our band, it's going to determine the angle in which our slope approaches the corner frequency. Now, that might sound a little jargony, but I think when I demonstrate it, you're going to see pretty clearly what I mean. If I boost up this high shelf, right-click, and go to order, you're going to see that I have a few options here. I have one that says 2. This is going to be our standard default order. And then up here I have these ones that say steep, those are going to be higher magnitude orders, and they're going to have a sharper, steeper angle in which they approach. Whereas if I go below, I have these gentle ones, which are going to be more gradual and softer in their approach. So if, for example, I switch this over to steep 8, you'll notice that once we hit the corner frequency, our boost comes up pretty immediately. If, however, I switch it over to gentle 8, you see that this is a lot more gradual. This is going to function in conjunction with the Q control. So if I say make this a very, very narrow band, and I switch it to steep, I can get this very resonant filter here where I actually get a bump above the corner frequency and a resonant dip below the corner frequency. This is sometimes called a Z-shelf, and it creates a very specific colored sound. In general, the steeper the onset of our corner frequency, the less transparent it's going to be and the more color we're going to get from it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we want that color because we like the effect of it. Sometimes we want things to sound a little bit more natural, and for that we're going to want to go to our gentler settings. One of the most unique effects that we can get is targeting the density of our bands by changing the order of a peaking or bell curve. For example, if I switch this over to steep, you'll notice that this almost creates a square of tone. This has a very unique and interesting sound. As opposed to a more typical filter, which we would see, like this 2 order. So while you can hear that the same corner frequency is in effect, and the similar effect is being created in terms of our boost, the actual context and the actual coloring of the sound is pretty remarkably different. Now, to round everything out, I'm going to show you how I would approach EQing the beat in general to make it sound a little bit more exciting, a little bit more defined, and a little bit more open. Let's give it a listen. In general, I think it sounds really good, but I think it could use a little bit more bite and a little bit more snap. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take up a peaking EQ, and I'm going to make it a little bit broader because I want to cover just a general area of tone rather than one specific thing. You can hear that when I set it to 2.966 kilohertz, about 3K, that really creates a very definitive snap on the snare drum. So this is probably where I want to boost. I think I want to provide a little bit of air to the top end as well. Now, I like what that's done, except I don't like how strident the hat has become, so what I'm going to do is pull up another peaking EQ, and this time I'm going to make it more narrow. I'm going to see if I can target that specific area of the hi-hat that feels just a little bit harsh. Just around 8K. Now, the low mids to me feel just a little bit fluffy, meaning there's maybe a little bit more content there. I'm going to see if I can find exactly what's kind of bothering me. I think it's something that's really coming between the kick bass and that main synth, and if I can target it, I might just attenuate a little bit to tighten up the sound overall. Now I just want the bass to be a little bit stronger, a little bit firmer, and I want to hear a little bit more bounce from the kick. All right, let's bypass our EQ. Let's find out whether or not we've improved the sound by changing whether or not it's in. Before. After. I think in general we've improved the sound. I do think that the EQ would need a little bit of fine tuning from here, but we're definitely on the right path. So that's an EQ and basically how it works.